Welcome to day 2 of our webinar, Building Sustainable Peace After Genocide, Lessons from Rwanda and Bosnia and Herzegovina. I hope that some of you were able to join us yesterday for truly remarkable presentations regarding peace building after the genocide in Rwanda. Today we turn our attention to Bosnia and Herzegovina and the genocide there and efforts to promote sustainable peace in its aftermath. Before we begin, I'd like to ask for a moment of silent prayer or reflection for the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina, for the people of Rwanda, and for all those peoples around the world who are suffering from war and any forms of violence that they may be encountering. Thank you. So we're going to begin this morning with our panel on women and religious peace builders in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I am delighted to introduce our esteemed speakers that will be joining us today. First, we will have Dr. Zorica Maros, who studied philosophy and theology as an undergraduate in Sarajevo. She continued her postgraduate studies in Rome at the Accademia Alfonsania, receiving her master's degree in 2007. In 2010, she returned to Bosnia and Herzegovina and began working at the Catholic Theological faculty in Sarajevo. She defended her doctoral dissertation in 2013 on the topic of dealing with violence in ethnic conflict. Is it possible to speak of forgiveness as a moral obligation? She currently teaches fundamental moral theology, virtue ethics, ethics of Christian marriage, and bioethics at the graduate level. Additionally, she teaches on violence in ethnic conflicts and about forgiveness. Her research interests include the principles of moral action, bioethical issues, and in a special way, the phenomenon of violence and the possibility of forgiveness and reconciliation in post-conflict ethnic and religiously plural societies. Next, we will hear from Dr. Zilka Spahić Šiljak, who is an associate professor in gender studies and a Muslim feminist and an activist. The scope of her work includes addressing cutting-edge issues such as human rights, politics, religion, gender-based violence, education and peace building, and she has more than 20 years of experience in academic teaching and activism. Zilka was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University, a researcher at Stanford University, and taught at various US and European universities. She currently serves as academic director of the Gender Resource Center at the University of Sarajevo and as director of the TPO Foundation. She also teaches at several universities as a guest lecturer, and she launched the first online school for feminism and religion, FER, in the Balkans region as a platform for challenging gender stereotypes that are often justified by both religion and culture. Dr. Spahić Šiljak has authored or co-authored many books. I'll just name a few. Among them, Gender Equality, Barometer of Bosnia and Herzegovina, published in 2024. I'm going to try to pronounce Rud I Globalizacija, Gender and Globalization at the University Gender Resource Center, TPO Foundation, 2023. Mainstreaming Gender Equality at Universities in the Balkans, published in 2023. And Shining Humanity, Life Stories of Women in BIH, published in 2024. Dr. Spahić Šiljak is also the co-designer of the documentary film Bosnian Muslim Women's Rituals, Hula Singing, Reciting, and Teaching in Sarajevo. And our last speaker this morning will be Elma Bešlić. Elma was born in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1989. She was raised in seized Sarajevo. Elma is a daughter, sister, cousin, volunteer, and most importantly, a human being. While pursuing a law degree, she found purpose in building and helping local communities and disadvantaged youth. She's very passionate in supporting a free media and women's rights. Elma has over 13 years of experience in the non-governmental sector and is currently employed in the International Organization for Migration as the Community Engagement Specialist. Currently, her work is focused on empowering trust and cohesion in Bosnia and Herzegovina's communities. She's passionate about contributing to building sustainable peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In her daily work, Elma is involved with different organizations that are working on peace-building processes, including the Youth for Peace organization. She's prepared workshops and educational camps targeting socially disadvantaged children, youth, and orphans, prepared lessons focusing on the topics of human dignity and bullying. Elma has also prepared training for law students from different local communities in Bosnia and Herzegovina and workshops about the media's role in the peace-building process for young people from Bosnia and Herzegovina and the region. I think you'll all agree that we are truly privileged to hear from these esteemed speakers this morning. Thank you so much for being with us, to all of you. And I will ask Zorica to speak first.
Okay, thank you, Jerry, for your kind words. Thank you for invitation. It's my honor. So the title, I have no presentation. I will read my presentation. The title is Religion in War and Peace, Some Aspects. And I've organized my presentation into 4 parts. In the first part, I will discuss the misuse of collective memory and the influence of religion on such memory. In the second part, I will talk about the struggle for victim status as one of the forms of this misuse. And the third part will focus on the need for cleansing the memory as one of the ways to resist political religion, memory misuse, and victimization. In the fourth and final part, I will provide a brief overview of our theology's peace-building efforts. So, the following text describes 2 recent events. I teach a course on violence in ethnic conflict and the possibility of forgiveness at the joint master's program Interreligious Studies and Peacebuilding. In the last semester, a student from the faculty, an imam, confided in me that he felt uncomfortable sharing with his community that he had enrolled in the program and attended lectures. In a separate incident, my colleague, a Catholic priest, disagreed with my criticism of nationalist parties during a television program. He believed that these parties were not actually nationalists, but rather national, at least not ours, as he said. So, if our webinar is focused on what we have learned from Bosnia and Herzegovina's experience, I believe that I can conclude my presentation with the aforementioned points. There are numerous and complex reasons for their attitudes toward religion in our region, which require a cautious approach. Simplification of these complex issues can lead to ideological misunderstanding. However, I would like to highlight the misuse of memory, which according to sociological research, religion in our region has significantly contributed to. Judging by the general social atmosphere and the examples mentioned, it seems that they are not doing much to free memory from this burden of evil. So, misuse of memory is social belief deeply ingrained in the foundation of collective memory. Collective memory is not the shared recollection of a group's past, structured on the basis of critical research methods. Rather, it is a shared narration of the group's past. This collective memory is often manipulated to create a version of history that is politically useful, aesthetically appealing, or emotionally acceptable. This manipulated memory becomes a reference point for the group's identity, providing a cognitive map that reassures them about who they are. This memory becomes a point of reference which serves not only as the basis for the creation of identity, but also for its legitimacy. The influence of religion in this type of memory lies precisely in defining and protecting one's identity, namely in the historical development of civilization as interpreted from the perspective of functional sociology, religious memory is a form of genetic survival strategy that is biological memory to which the memory of a group, tribe, or nation is added by the subsequent development of society. According to the sociological interpretation, the historical formation of civilization took place during times of great danger, threats, and violence, which is why protection from the gods was sought through bloody cultic acts of human and animal sacrifice. Although throughout the long history, this memory of the species tried to be ennobled and spiritualized, whenever man's bare survival was threatened, he necessarily returned to his primordial state of fear and struggle for his survival or the survival of the belongings group, as well as seeking help in that struggle through religious patterns. Many different authors agreed about the impact of this collective memory, of which religious memory is its integral part, on the outbreak of war in the 19th. In fact, during communism, in the name of brotherhood and unity of all people, the historical memories of different ethnic groups, for example, the memory of the horror of World War II, were systematically suppressed and selectively banned. However, disparities of collective memory between different ethnic groups continue to exist, usually within different religious communities. The denial of historical events created an environment that allowed the emergence of nationalist objection to the account of history, which were then used as justification for the war in the 90s. Invoking the horrors of World War II, those massacres were posthumously justified. It is necessary to emphasize that the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina was a conflict between peoples who were also members of different religions, Islamic, Orthodox, and Catholic. This religious identity was confronted with ethnic and in current times with national identity. Namely, since Bosnia and Herzegovina was without its own state organization for centuries, it never had a developed national identity, but primarily an ethnic one, in the formation of which religion made a significant contribution. Religious communities were the custodian of common identity, i.e., linguistic, cultural, and political determinants and values, which is why during the war in the 19th, they were drawn into the process of restoring old painful memories. The situation in the 19th, the situation of extreme danger and terrible fears, awakened in people the biological mechanisms of the survival strategy, which, as has been said, are always connected with natural religiosity. Although, therefore, the war was not religious, it was not completely devoid of a religious dimension. The ideology of nationalism awakened memories, and memories fueled conflicts. However, just as the war was not religious, it was also not exclusively a war of unreconciled past and memory of suffering, but without their influence, it would not have been as brutal as it was, i.e., without them, it would hardly have created new unreconciled memories. These new unreconciled memories find their common expression in victimization. As I said, many of the crimes committed during the 19th were correcting the historical crimes, its posthumous justification. As for today's form of victimization, it has profiled itself through the ubiquitous phenomenon of a struggle for victim status or competition in suffering. The struggle for victim status refers not only to the fact of historical suffering, but also to the fact that this suffering is politically manipulated. Each group involved in a long, violent conflict focuses on its suffering. Each group believes that its victim is greater than the victim of the other group. The struggle for victim status seemed to stem from the rigid constructs of victim versus perpetrator, which are mutually exclusive roles and identities. The victim's role is impenetrable, and if one is the victim, the other is necessarily, by definition, the perpetrator. It is important to emphasize that such a way of thinking does not primarily stem from the need to discredit the suffering of another group, but rather stems from the need to acknowledge one's suffering. This need is combined with the fear that any recognition of someone else's victim will not only challenge one's suffering, but also impose the rule of the perpetrator. Although it can be confirmed in opposite viewpoints, insisting on the status of the victim not only undermines moral reasoning and future-oriented political action, but is also often associated with a reduced desire and incentiveness for forgiveness and reconciliation. In that competition, I find especially dangerous the fact that it creates and permanently feeds the danger of new violence, since it keeps atrocity alive and hatred present. Consequently, misuse of the past was not only one of the causes of the war in the 19th, but it is also present in today's socio-political environment. Thus, today's Bosnian and Herzegovinian society does not have a collective memory of the common victim of the war in the 19th. Croats have their victims, Serb theirs, Bosniak theirs, and the perpetrators are always the others. All three ethnic groups entered in the war in the 19th, believing exclusively they were historical victims and that they were correcting historical crimes, and all three nations still carry the same suffering, separate and selective memory of the war from the 19th. If the memory of the crimes they did to each other during the Second World War, or even much earlier, was one of the reasons for correcting the past by fighting the war in the 19th, I wonder where would lead the memory of the crimes from the 19th if those are as well to be corrected. And so what did we learn? Disturbingly, nothing new and different from what was formulated after Auschwitz. If we don't change the fundamental paradigms of action, what happened will happen again. We therefore have to change the fundamental paradigms of action if we do not want to repeat the violent past by correcting it with new crimes. Changing the paradigms of action is a very urgent call and challenge to our society. The urgency of this change is called not only by civil responsibility of co-building today's socio-political scene, but also by the Christian demand for memory cleansing, by taking collective responsibility not only for the evil that happened, but also for the evil that outlives in present. Religion, regarding now memory cleansing, religions are unlikely to be completely free from various forms of abuse because their content is transmitted by people who are vulnerable and subject to various internal compulsions and external pressures. Drawing into the process of memory restoration, the religious communities in our area, whether naively or knowingly, agreed to the game of serving political power, thus gaining a political dimension. However, in Christianity, there should be no remembrance of evil. Political religion uses secular benefits and political categorization to preserve and establish an individual's identity. True faith, however, constantly challenges and questions an individual's identity, liberating them from the spiritual bondage, internal compulsion, and external pressure by virtue of their fidelity to Christ. Socially manipulated and driven by political benefits, the people of faith subordinated Christianity to their biological and social needs, even though Christianity requires an opposite enactment. Christianity focuses on the death on the cross as the only way of salvation, and never the biological drive to survive at the expense of someone else's death, or the social need for affirmation at the expense of someone else's extermination. Following Christ, which is the only way to confirm one's Christianity, Christians are called to establish a goodness that will not live on the death of others. Here Christ is determined, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. Thus, true faith requires crazy boldness and crazy goodness from believers in order to oppose internal and external condition with spiritual means. Opposing the ideologization of religion or correcting bad memory and victimization can be achieved by taking a new approach to history. This new approach should eliminate the compulsion to repeat the mistakes of the past. Pope John Paul II recognized the need for this new approach and sought forgiveness for all wrongs, omissions, and insults committed by Christians throughout history. He initiated a cleansing of the church's historical memory. Christians bear responsibility not only for the evil done in the past, but also for how it continues to manifest in new forms in today's situations. The Pope called on believers to cleanse their memory of unfaithfulness, inconsistency, and the lie in order to move forward. Cleansing the memory is not erasing what happened, nor forgetting what needs to be remembered. Memory cleansing is the process of freeing personal and collective consciousness from the legacy of guilt from the past. The cleansing of memory is a renewed historical and theological evaluation of the past that will lead, if it is correct, to the appropriate recognition of what has been done, which can contribute to the reconciliation of nations. Only with such a moral judgment can one avoid historicism in history, a historicism that turns into a type of defense which, as our current situation and the aforementioned struggle for the status of a victim shows, has become a political means of preserving power. Cleansing memory is the reconstruction of history. It is not denial of history, but rather its confirmation so that it can be healed. Memory cleansing is an effort of the spirit, intellect, and will, a creative way of reshaping human memory from initial conflict and evil to reconciliation, forgiveness, and shaping a different future. Maybe one of the best examples of this creative memory is biblical holy memory, or remembering the Exodus and the cross. In celebrating these feasts, every believer is called to meditate on their meanings, not slavery and oppression in Egypt, nor the violence of the cross, but God's grace of liberation from them. Because, and I quote, if God is not remembered, then the memory of everything that is not God remains, end of quote. Christian memory does not advocate forgetting, especially not one that would lead to the repetition of evil. What needs not to be forgotten is the liberation from evil. This holy memory also preserves a law that warns us that the innocent should never suffer again in our presence. Now, I would like to briefly say what we as Catholic Theological Faculty have done in peace building process. The claim that the innocent should never suffer again in our presence was one of the reasons for my involvement in peace building. After defending my doctorate thesis with the approval of the former administration of our faculty, I started the project, which lasted for 3 years, from 2014 to 2017. Each year consisting of 6 panels open to all citizens and 1 conference at the end of the academic year. The general title of the project was From War to Reconciliation, the Contribution of Religious Communities to the Restoration and Healing of Society. Within 3 years, I presented topics through tribunes and conference: violence in ethnic conflicts, injustices in Bosnian and Herzegovinian society, and forgiveness and reconciliation. The forums were open to the public, and for each panel, I invited guest lecturers from different scientific disciplines and religious backgrounds. To my knowledge, that project was the first of its kind in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the first time since the war that an academic and religious institution began to address these topics systematically and openly. Therefore, it took us 20 years to start working together, at least in this way, to face what happened and to begin the existentially necessary catharsis of communities and society as a whole. The second thing that we as a faculty did in order to build peace was at the very beginning mentioned joint master study called Interreligious Study and Peace Building. This program is offered by the Catholic Faculty of Theology, the Faculty of Islamic Sciences, and the Orthodox Faculty of Theology, and was launched in the academic year 2017-2018. In this master's program, students get to study the belief system of all 3 religions, Islam, Orthodoxy, and Catholicism, and their understanding of war, violence, forgiveness, and peace, after which they switch to the practical application module. The composition of the students is diverse, brought from an ethnic and religious standpoint, which adds value to the overall program. And to that study, I teach a course that I designed based on my doctoral thesis. In my research, I was guided by the question, how did the former completely regular and completely ordinary neighbor turn into an equally completely regular and completely ordinary evildoer? The subject is divided into 3 parts. In the first part, I analyze some of the individual mechanisms and social strategies that influenced the creation of a violent man. In the second part, I thematize a kind of ethics of resistance to that shaping, that is, the ethics of resistance to the previous mentioned adopted paradigms of action. The third part is dedicated to the possibility of forgiveness as possibility of the victim being freed from the evil once survived, the possibility of the perpetrator being freed from the evil caused, but also the possibility of victory over the evil itself, which, as we saw from misuse of the memory, outlives both the death of the victims and the death of the perpetrator, creating new victims and new perpetrators. Finally, what have we learned? That is what the war awakens, the political compromises of the powerful cannot calm down. The current social and political situation, as well as the example mentioned at the beginning, do not give much reason for some intellectual optimism, but even more, pessimism of will and spirit should not be allowed. What is socially impossible should at least be wanted spiritually. We must save that feeling for what it should be, whether or not it is achievable at a given moment. And why, in the end, to spiritually want what is socially unworkable? Because there is a proven causal connection between misuse of memory and wars. If we do not understand the importance of cleansing memory, which involves conversion, repentance, forgiveness, and reconciliation as demand of the faith and social responsibility, we risk repeating the painful processes of self-destruction through the confirmation of personal and collective memories. Recognizing our co-responsibility for past wars and evils, and changing the fundamental paradigms that allow them to happen is something we must do in the present moment. As ethical beings, no one can avoid this responsibility. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maros, for that rich presentation. We're very grateful. I ask the audience to hold, we will do question and answer after all three panelists. You can, however, present your questions in the Q&A box or raise your hand to be acknowledged after all three speakers finish. So at this time, I invite Dr. Spahić, Šiljak.
Thank you, Gerald. Just to share my presentation. I hope you can see it. Hello, everyone, and it's my pleasure to be part of this webinar, and thank you, Professor Beyer, for this invitation, and thank you all for being with us and listening from the experiences from Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Balkans context. So my topic is about feminist ethics in peace building. And I'm going to say few words about the context in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Balkans, just a bit, and then move on to present what I mean by feminist ethics in peace building, and in the third part to present few of vignettes from women's peace building efforts in this region. So when we mention feminist ethics, we ask ourselves, what is it? And this is one of the quotes I borrow just to clarify what I mean by that. It is about understanding and criticizing and correct how gender operates within our moral beliefs and practices. It is also about the binary view of gender we have in most of our societies, then the privileges that have been historically available to men, and also about the ways how we view gender that maintain oppressive social order or practices that harm others, and especially girls and women, and among girls and women, those who are marginalized in society, like minorities and etc. So I'm going to just say a few words about gender equality and gender in the Balkans context. As probably most of you know, that Bosnia and Herzegovina was part of a former socialist Yugoslav Republic till 1980s. And in the socialist time, gender equality was imposed by the constitution and by the law. So Communist Party proclaimed that gender equality was resolved. So there was no need to tackle it at all, which was, of course, not the true. And although in the socialism, gender equality was proclaimed from above, in the private sphere specifically, it didn't abolish patriarchal relations and structures that subordinate women to men. So as Slobodanka Markov in her work noticed, and I quote her, patriarchal system prevailed, keeping women out of power and decision-making mainstream. Despite the fact that women in the socialist Yugoslavia had the space to be politically engaged, and they were represented in politics with 24%, this was not full gender equality. And women in that period and even today face feminization of occupations, feminization of poverty, and violence against women, which is one of the burning problems in our society. So one of the biggest changes and the crossroad that our society went through was the period of the end of 20th century, when we had the first democratic multi-party elections. And when Yugoslav state was dissolved, ethno-national ideologies came to power, and the role of women was completely diminished through the emphasis of the new roles of mother of nation. As I said, although women had civil and political rights to a certain degree, and they participated in politics with 20%, when ethno-national political parties came to power, that percentage was significantly reduced to 2 to 4%. What was also important to notice at that period, that religion, which was marginalized from public sphere, entered the empty public square, and religious nationalism, as Paul Moises and some other scholars name it, became one of the most powerful responses to modern secular state in the Balkans region. So after the fall of communism, with war destruction from 1991 to 1995, genocide in Srebrenica, war crimes, wartime rapes, and etc., we are in this region, and specifically in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we experience a liberal democracy and emphasis on civil and political rights. And at the same time, religious communities emphasized also and worked to reaffirm the traditional cultural values, because they believed that socialism ruined the traditional family. So it was the momentum to regain traditional cultural values and the role of women within it. So, of course, feminist organizations and women's organizations at that time were not silent, and they organized themselves from 1990s immediately, and they protested against the war, against violence, and they have been keeping protesting even today, because that they don't want to agree, you know, with the roles that have been imposed to women from 1990s. In that period, basically what we can find in literature, women were designated as mothers of nation, which means that they had to sacrifice themselves for the nation, for the family. So on one hand, men present unified territory to others, to govern it, to manage it, to keep it, to protect it from the enemy. And therefore, men were forced to kill, to destroy, to rape, while they were protecting their ethnic or national group. At the same time, women's bodies were considered as national territory. So violating that integrity of that territory could be a crime or a victory, depending on the participant's point of view. So, and in most of the cases, women ended up as collateral damage during the war. So thousands of women were subjected to mass rapes and various types of sexual violence because they were vulnerable, and it was one of the ways to humiliate and destroy the nation's pride, as it was interpreted, you know, as women's bodies were interpreted. So on one hand, national ideologies, ethno-national ideologies, and also religious communities that supported these national ideologies venerated women as mothers who bear future soldiers for the nation. And on the other hand, when these venerated mothers or sisters were raped, they were considered as fallen Madonnas, so they were not anymore attractive or anymore interesting for the nation. So they didn't care of these women. So women's organization, and I have been part of many of them from the war, when the first clinic for wartime rape women was established in 1993 by German feminists who came to Bosnia to help us. Have been trying, you know, to do the peace work the feminist way. What it means. Basically, they wanted to make a shift, a move from gender essentialism to engendered peace and reconciliation. And as late Marina Blagojević, a sociologist and a scholar from Serbia, noticed, and I quote her, engendering reconciliation means to reshape dominant discourses on reconciliation and women, and I would add also dominant discourses of feminism. So feminists were against androcentrism, misogyny, hegemonic, militarized and toxic masculinity, and gender-blind policies. Very often, you know, when we talk to people in power and even women who have power, they are not gender sensitive, and they apply gender-blind policies that basically help only those who already have power. So some of the key principles of feminist ethics in peace building are ethics of care and ethics of justice. And many scholars wrote about it. One of them is Uma Narayan, who notices something which is very important to have in mind when we talk about this. And I quote her, that justice without care may be harsh and care without justice may be oppressive. Which is very important for those who are directly involved in peace and reconciliation activities. And I also have a couple of other quotes I want to share with you from John Tronto, who said that we cannot understand an ethics of care until we place such an ethics in its full moral and political context. And the second one is that care is not solely private or parochial. It can concern institutions, societies, even global levels of thinking, which means that it is not only individual or a question or interest of some groups. It can really transcend our individual or groups' efforts. So one of the authors, like Fiona Robinson, dealt with the feminist ethics, and she says that feminist ethics of care requires relational ontology, which means that we have to take care of how humans live their lives, how we make focus and attention, and how we are responsive and responsible, and what kind of commitments we have when we address these moral problems in historical, but also in real context, not the imagined one, but real context in which we live, like we in the post-war Bosnian and Herzegovinian context. Elizabeth Porter is another scholar from Australia who also discussed the feminist ethics, and for her, it is focused on women's experiences and is cross-disciplinary in seeking alternatives. These alternatives emphasize personal experience, context, nurture, and relationships, which is really important and reflect what women's organizations, specifically feminist women's organizations in Bosnia and Herzegovina and more broadly in the Balkans context have done in the last 30 years. So I also want to continue and just to reflect briefly on the feminist ethics that whatever we do, either research or direct peace and reconciliation work, we have to have in mind that knowledge production and the knowledge we use at universities and etc. is always situated. For feminists, women's experiences also matters. I also wanted to add this Mark Gopin's concept of compassionate reasoning, which is really important when we talk about peace building and reconciliation, because mere empathy that is painful and that can devastate us is not helpful if we are not able to develop compassionate reasoning. Another issue that is very important is struggle against dualisms and male privileges that are overwhelmingly everywhere in public life, and also to have emancipatory gender policies in everything what we do. To be able to break down dualistic perspectives, first, it is important to take seriously women's lives, experiences, and bodies. And as Tammy Spray notices, that liberatory epistemology with the woman's body as the locus of meaning and experience is crucial. So we cannot discuss, for instance, wartime rape or crimes or genocide or anything else without woman's body and her own experience of it. The second, feminist ethics also interrogates the male privileging of what constitutes security and insecurity. And in today's discussions about security, there is no gender component. No one asks women, what is security from their own point of view. And the third, feminist approach proposes alternatives that emphasize personal experience, relationships, context, and nurture, as Elizabeth Porter found in her work. And in the third part, I want to briefly just to present a couple of women I explored in my research in the book Shining Humanity, just to show you an examples, from the Bosnian post-war recovery, peace building, and reconciliation processes, and women from all ethnic and religious and non-religious background, what they have done and how they raise their voices and how their work was influential in their local communities and beyond. One of them is Radmila Žigić. She comes from northeastern part of the country, Bijeljina, where terrible crimes happened at the beginning of the war. And as a journalist, basically during the war and after the war, she was investigating trafficking in women, because many women, especially women from Bosnia and the region, but also women who came after the war from Ukraine, Moldova, and other East European countries, happened to be in prison in private houses, and they served as for prostitution. So she and her colleagues fought against it. And she really wanted to give voices to those who didn't have voices. They established the first shelter for these women, and later also the shelter for all women who suffered from gender-based violence. And they have been advocated for gender-sensitive policies since then. And today they are running a huge campaign, a peace with women's spaces. The second The second woman is Danka Zelić from western part of the country, Bosansko Grahovo. She comes from the Catholic tradition, and she's an amazing figure who was a police officer during the war. And when she noticed that basically her own ethnic group was not helpful and didn't want to accept Serb Orthodox Christian returnees in that city, she left her job and dedicated herself to help returnee population. And she was called in that region Mother of Returnees because she has been traveling all around the country, specifically western part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, to help returnee women and children and all others, and also to initiate interreligious and intercultural dialogue. Another woman that comes from the central part of the country is Sabiha Husic. She's of Muslim background, and she has started her own work in Medica Zenica in 1993 as a psychosocial therapist, and as one of these women who established shelters for gender-based violence victims and then survivors. She basically initiated systemic approaches for shelters to include governmental institutions and the referral mechanisms that has to be part of addressing this problem. And as a religious person also, she always brought her religious perspective to human rights activism. And there is one of the quotes from her work: "In my understanding of Islam, humanity comes first. The best framework for religious freedom is secular state." And for those of us who are religious persons, we understand why secular state is important and is the only viable framework for human rights so far. For human rights of all, both believers and non-believers. And one more woman, Jadranka Milicevic from Sarajevo, who is a prominent activist and a member of Women in Black, and who really has done a great job during the war and after the war, even today. And I have one of her quotes here where she says, "I think that everything I have done with my friends contribute to peace in Bosnia. Absence of war, and if nobody shoots, doesn't mean that we have normal conditions for life, because no one will bring us and provide us with better living conditions. We can only do it by ourselves." From this quote, you can see, her activism, how her activism talks. And this is the book that Gerald also mentioned during the introduction. So you can read more about these women and other women that I wrote about in the book. And in the end, I want to share a few lessons that what I heard from yesterday's presentations, that it's important to have women at decision-making positions, to be part of the society, to be represented in politics. But it is not enough just to have numbers. It is important to have gender-sensitive women. Then we also need to work on transformation of leadership structures and gender roles, because so far we have masculine models of leadership that very often are obstacles for women leaders, because it is rooted in the philosophy of hierarchy and winner-loser. There is no collaboration, solidarity, and helping everyone to thrive. So gender-sensitive models of leadership should be based in cooperation, respect, justice, and compassionate reasoning. And in the end, I wanna close my presentation with the quote from Birgitta Dahl, a member of Swedish Parliament, who said neither men nor women should conform to traditional roles. Women don't have to act like men to get power, and men should not act like women to be allowed to take care of their children. When this pattern becomes the norm, then we will see real change. And I hope we will see real changes in the Bosnian context, but also in other contexts. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Spahić Šiljak, for that highly informative presentation. We now turn to Elma Bešlić, our final speaker. Elma?
Thank you so much for having me here. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. It's such a pleasure and honor to speak after Dr. Maros and Dr. Spahić Šiljak. I mean, I'm honored to be among these amazing women that I look up to, especially in the context of my own country and the work that's being done in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Today, I think I will be speaking more from the perspective of, I would say, you and how all of these lessons that we want to share and represent can come through an individual person. So I will speak from my own experience and the lessons that I saw through my work in different local communities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I was born and raised in the siege Sarajevo. And I think being a kid and growing up after everything that happened to my country was quite hard, in a sense of trying to figure out who are you as a person and how all of these different identities and what happened can shaped me in a way as a person. I come from, I would say, a really diverse family, which was like ethnically mixed, which was completely destroyed by the war that happened, because I had uncles who were at the Chetnik side, which is like ultra Serb nationalists. And then I had family members who were Serbs Orthodox, but still like being prosecuted by the Bosniaks. So my family was completely torn apart. And growing up, I realized quite early that all of this peace building and everything that comes after the war is, in fact, comes from the house, from the family. So when we are talking about all the ethics and moral, I would say some of the most important values, they start within the family. So I was lucky enough to have parents who had every right to like teach me hate and, you know, to be like, oh, you now need to hate this or hate. But they chose the path of love and compassion and understanding. So that's the environment I started to grow up, right? And through my growing up, I started working with a lot of, I engaged in volunteering and activism when I was in a high school. And then what happened, I met so many different young people who experience different stories, different scars, but somehow when the war ended in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they just said, now it's the peace time, and we somehow put everything under the carpet and said, we will not talk about these traumas, right? So I think that's one of the main reasons why my country, my people, and I would say the region in general is always one step forward and two steps backwards. And I see that in my daily life and in the daily work that I'm doing. So after I met all of these different young people and worked with them, you can organize a lot of conferences and you can give trainings to young people, and they understand the concept. But when they go back to their families, to their small local communities that are driven by the nationalism or driven by the hate, it's so hard for them to maintain this, I would say, the moral vertical of what's happening. Unfortunately, our country is, by the constitution, which is unconstitutional, still divided. And that gives a lot of, I would say, challenges and reasons why there is a lot of brain drain in Bosnia and Herzegovina and young people that are leaving this country because they cannot cope with the system. that we are currently living in. I know many ask me, why am I still in this country, or why am I still fighting for this country? And the reason and the answer is honest, that I don't know. I just love this country. I love my people. I think we have so much to give and so much to provide. And as a young female feminist Muslim woman, I have to be here for my country and wake up. I wake up in the morning and say, I did all the best that I could to help my society and the people who are living in this society. So I think one of the biggest lessons that I learned, and I hopefully a lot of young people will learn after all of this genocide and atrocities, is that we don't take peace for granted. Because we always ask ourselves, how did this happen? You know, nobody believed it would happen. I always say, as evil is always working on evil, so good always have to work on good. Because if you take things for granted, if we just take for granted the fact that we are living currently in the peace, the war can happen tomorrow. So even if you think, oh, you know, we're all okay, we're good, we still need to educate ourselves, we still need to support ourselves, we need to be there for each other. For me, one of the greatest, I think, sentences that I read was that it's not the eyes that are blind, it's the hearts. And I think that's also the message that I think it's important to be shared after all of these atrocities and the genocide that happened and that are happening currently in the world. And another really, really important thing in regards to personally young people, I would say, in Bosnia and Herzegovina and everything that's happening after the war, that as young people who are living and like are trying to figure out their identities and where are we in all of this mixture of what's happened and what people are telling us and what we know and what we research and how we work with, is the fact that it's so important to know that we are all walking peacemakers or peace building activists. I think this is especially important in the time where we are currently living in, because all of our social media coverage, everything that we can raise our voices about, it's important. It's equally important as doing all the academic research, as doing all of the political advocacy, as building societies and working with disadvantaged communities and groups. Why? Because if you look at the peace building process, it's not just one path. It's the whole mosaic of what we can do, how religion can influence this, how different groups can influence this. This is the joint effort of building communities towards the peace. And this is not only for the societies that are living the peace or who have survived different wars. This is also for the societies that didn't experience the war. It's something that we as a human beings need to try to listen to ourselves more closely and give this space for the different stories and the narratives. I think what was really important and that what was discussed was about this, I would say, common identities and having the common commemorization, etc., that still didn't happen in our country because of the national rhetorics and narratives. That's one step forward, but unfortunately, we are always going 2 steps backwards in this country. But I think that the fight needs to be there. And I think the voices of the people who think that they are not heard are important to be heard. Because if you come to Bosnia and Herzegovina, you will find some of the most amazing people who are living in their small local communities and are advocating for peace, but are being judged not only by their local community, but also by their family and friends. And I had privilege to work with these people. I worked with the war veterans. Those are some of the amazing males who survived the war and now are giving the lectures to young people why to never start or get involved in the war. I worked with some of the most amazing women who were raped during the war and who had strength to speak about all of these issues and be there for women who are silently suffering within and carrying all of this. So when we are talking about, I would say, peace building processes, it's not something that's happening in some parallel universe, or it's happening only when we are having the conferences or only when we are speaking directly about it. It's happening in the daily life. So every time you think, oh, I don't know, I'm not a peace activist, or I'm not advocating for peace, or I cannot do anything in this regards, I feel powerless. I would like to say that one of the lessons I learned is that you are very powerful, and that all of these, I would say, conversations or rooms, or even having the dialogue with your family members is fighting for peace building and fighting for the better societies. Sometimes it's hard, and it can be draining. I'm sure everyone who is working on this topic would agree, but I think that's the purpose, because as a human beings, because for me, that's the first identity that I come across. When somebody asks me, what is my first identity? That's a human being. And that's something that this war and what happened to my country built inside of me. So I think when we are currently facing all of the atrocities around the world, right after Bosnia and Herzegovina and Rwanda, we said never again. And now we have the live stream of the different atrocities across the globe. So I think but the lessons that we needs to be conveyed, I would say, and the things that we need to do is that we can only make it together for peace and for peace building. Why? Because as I already said, this mosaic that we are creating together is the only path forward. I think Bosnia and Herzegovina has a lot of steps to go, of course, in the future. But also it's important to know that there are some of the amazing individuals who are working on it every day. And we can never forget the influence, I would say, of media in the concept of especially, I would say, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Because if you look at the media, and when I say media, I'm not just thinking about the portals and like TV station and radio. I'm talking about also social media. We are talking about Facebook, Instagram, and all of this widely accessible networks that we can use. We can also use it for positive. We don't have to always use it for negative, but sometimes it's hard when all of this negative overwhelms the positive, because unfortunately I would say the nationalism that's always in the rise when it's election year in Bosnia and Herzegovina is something that definitely is something that we have from the 90s, and it's still continuing in the local communities. And sometimes you will not maybe feel it in the bigger communities, I would say, but in the small communities where people are still, I would say, afraid of speaking out and being present about what happened in the past and about their own traumas and about how they can live and provide their own truths, I think it's quite hard. I think also one of the big reasons why this country is facing so many challenges is also our, I would say, judicial system. which has its own challenges and faces corruption. And I think in the context of when we are talking about justice, justice is something I think we are just striving for. But in the eyes of the people who survived traumas that are beyond, I would say, words or beyond something that they can express, forgiveness is something that can liberate you. So I would say always forgive, but not to forget. Why not to forget? Because if we forget what happened, it can easily happen again. And I think, especially being, let's say, a woman in the society that still is facing so many challenges, and especially being as well as young, well, not so young as I used to be, but still being as a young person who is trying to work on all of these issues, it's quite hard. It's challenging, and every time when somebody asks you, why are you doing this? Why you are trying to make things better, or why do you want to make things better? For me, the answer is always the same. The peace doesn't have alternative. Peace is something that we should not take for granted, as I said. And if we continue to strive and to build and rebuild our local communities, I'm sure that atrocities in the world, we could at least influence it, I would say. Because thanks to today's modern world we're living in, we definitely have a power. We definitely have the voices. And with this, I would like to conclude in a way to say that all of these lectures that I heard from yesterday and that I heard today, this is why I do it. Because this is the empowerment. This is the way to know that you are not alone. Because sometimes being in the peace building processes and working with the people, sometimes you feel that you are left alone and that nobody understands, but it's not true. There are so many amazing people, and we should never give up on peace, because that's something that's, I think, in us as a human beings, that's something that we need to cherish. That's something that we should strive for. So I will not take any of the time, because I would love if there are questions for us, because I know we have, I think, 15 more minutes.
Thank you so much, Elma, for your powerful insights and powerful story. That is correct. We have about 15 minutes for questions. Please feel free to enter your questions into the question and answer box or to raise your hand. There has been a question in the question box for some time, so I'm going to read it. You can also see it in the question and answer box. And this is for a question for you, Zorica. I'm going to read it, and it's also available to you in the question and answer box. Actually, it states, Dr. Maros or others, thanks for important points about collective memory and nationalism, relevant for Israel and Gaza, as well as Bosnia and elsewhere. I wanted to ask about concepts of justice and how these can exist alongside the need for forgiveness and reconciliation. Justice is a human need, though imperfect. How can we pursue it through negotiation without allowing it to become political score settling? So essentially, how to hold the two together, how to promote both reconciliation and forgiveness and still promote justice. And Zorica, if you would unmute.
Yes, now, yes. Do you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Okay, yes, thank you for this important question. It is difficult and complex. Difficult and complex relation between memory, justice, and forgiveness. How to achieve justice in a society where our heroes are their criminals and our criminals are their heroes. I think that although in the question is already said that the justice is imperfect, and as Elma said, forgiveness liberates you. That is something that pure cold justice cannot achieve. So justice, as I see it, forgiveness does not abolish the need for justice. Rather, it is a way of doing justice. So, how to do justice in front of a crime against humanity? That is the question which Vladimir Yankelevich, he wrote a book on forgiveness regarding the Auschwitz, and also it is a great book. And he said that there is no just punishment for such a level of crimes. If there were that kind of punishment, as he said, it would be a moral perversion, because it would mean that equalize what the victims went through with just punishment. That simply does not exist. So justice is, and I'm returning on what Elma said. Forgiveness liberates you. If justice, with the justice we can rebuild maybe society, but we cannot be liberated from the evil. We cannot be liberated from the suffering we went through. Justice can rebuild our houses, but it cannot bring our loved one in the life, and that is why justice is not. Forgiveness is not. It does not mean to abolish justice, as I said, but it is the way of doing justice where justice is powerful. I don't know if I need to say anything else. So sorry for my English.
No, perfect, Zorica. Zilka or Elma, would you like to speak to that question?
Yeah, I would like to add to what Zorica already said. Basically, the question was, how to negotiate, and then since I have been part of this interreligious peace building program that Zorica mentioned during her presentation. My part is exactly the art of negotiation in peace building, and I would like to just say a few words about that. Why this is important? Because when we talk about achieving justice and reconciliation and what to do, we have to have in mind that we are dealing with the politics, national or international, and politics is always a game of power. And we need to be aware how we negotiate, what kind of tools, what kind of skills we need to have to negotiate properly and to achieve justice. Most of the time, when we deal with the conflict resolution and when we try to find a solution to reconcile and to forgive and not to forget, which is sometimes really hard, we tend to think that resolving conflict and finding solution and achieving justice is not our own business, that it is up to them, not to us. And we really need to understand that we are responsible equally as the other side, but also we have to understand the other side. Try to at least to understand, but also try to identify their own interests and perceptions of what has happened. Of course, I mean, we have different perceptions. It is one reality and one the fact, but we have different perception of what has happened. And when we do that, we also need to show that we really care about it. And if people don't see that we don't care, we can have an amazing skills and amazing tools we will not accomplish anything. So having in mind that politics is a game of power, pardon me, and that we need to try at least to understand the other side, we really need to find our allies and to build coalitions, to be able to make some profound changes in our societies to achieve justice. Otherwise, I mean, it won't happen. And what Elma was also saying, and Zorica, you know, we can rebuild the infrastructure, we can rebuild the society and provide basic needs for the life. But if we don't rebuild the relationships that are broken, what John Paul Lederer emphasized in his work, you know, this is crucial, you know, how to rebuild the broken relationships and build new one, we will not be able to achieve genuine justice.
Elma, did you want to speak, Elma, to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I can maybe give one example when we are talking about the forgiveness and how to heal, like with this organization Youth for Peace that I'm also volunteering because it's my passion still to work in the field of peace building. I think one of the amazing moments was when we had my friends now who are Bosnia Catholic Serb who were born in 94 and 93. So their mothers were pregnant during the war and they all lost their fathers because of the war. So they got killed during the war. And the moment in which they realize that they feel the same pain, that they feel the struggles of their mother, that they feel this absence of their fathers is something that united them. So this grief and this was what happened to you, it's the same what happened to me, or to hear the stories of people of my generation or elderly young people who were during the siege of Sarajevo of different ethnicities and being there, it's the path towards forgiveness. And even though maybe we will not have justice as we said as a system, this forgiveness is something that keeps us alive and is building our communities. And I see the question that is directly addressed to me. So what is the best thing I have learned about both Islam and Christianity that can help peace building? For me, it's not just Islam and Christianity. It's any monotheistic religion. I always say, if we were only respecting the first 10 commandments, it would be peace in world. So you don't have to follow anything else, because in the monotheistic religions, first 10 commandments are basically the same. And one of them is, don't kill the neighbor, help the neighbor. So I think religions in its core have this peace building messages. It's just the different interpretations. And as I said, and as of course, Dr. Maros and Dr. Spahić Šiljak also said, it's how these narratives are used and how the political is using it for its own purposes. So I think the best thing is that if you have open heart and open mind, and it doesn't matter from which political or ethnical background you're coming from, peace building is something that you can definitely contribute and be there and be present and help the local communities be better and to strive for better.
So we have...
Gerald, if I can just add to what Elma said, all women I've been working with also said, the moment when you realize that the pain doesn't have ethnicity or religion, then you will be able to transcend all the differences and identities and to understand the pain of the other human being. So this is something what we need to come up with to be able, to start reconciliation.
Thank you to all of you. There's a question that relates to what we've been talking about, what you've been talking about, and it's regarding forgiveness. how would you define forgiveness? It seems the vast majority of offenders are not repentant. Is it always good to forgive the unrepentant? Does this not risk being taken as condoning what they've done? Or is it possible to be liberated from bitterness without forgiving?
I can start, and then
Okay.
you too, if you
Okay,
want.
Zilka.
Yeah, I can start, and then you can add to this. Basically, as all of us are human beings with emotions. I mean, we are emotional beings, and we have abilities to forget, but also to forgive, but also to forget. But we have to deal with resentment, with pain, with bitterness, betrayals. And the question is really how to find a transformative power in our souls, you know, to transcend all the grievances and to get to the pathway to healing and our own inner peace. So for me, it is important to embrace forgiveness. Not only for the sake of the other human being who did injustice to us, but also for the sake of ourselves and our journey towards forgiveness is not just a gift we are giving to the other human being, but it is primarily the gift we give to ourselves, because we liberate ourselves and we give a chance to ourselves for our personal growth and to build more profound connections and also to reach harmony in our own being. So it takes courage and strength, but also willingness you know, to work on this and to transcend all of these emotions that are taking us back and don't allow us, you know, to reach and to come to forgiveness. So yeah, this is from me now.
Okay, can I now?
Yes.
I would like just to add something that is on what Zilka already said. As I see forgiveness, it is dangerous to make any condition for forgiveness. Okay, humanly, from human standpoint, it will be easier to forgive someone who repents, because at least we get that kind of psychological or moral satisfaction. You are guilty and you repent. But if forgiveness is a power of the victim, and it is, nothing should condition it, that act, and no one can impose that act on a victim. It is victim's power, and nothing should take that power, take away that power from the victims.
I will just add, for me, it's like after a lot of darkness that you have and a lot of darkness you have within yourself, when the light strikes, the question is, what would you do with it? So for me, the forgiveness was the path. The love was path. And, you know, you can still have all of this forgiveness for people and for human beings, but at the same time, you can say, yes, but these humans who did the atrocities and who did all of this evil are not in fact humans. So you can still be the person who will say, I condemn that. I condemn that, but I forgive this. Because when we are talking about the collective identities or collective punishment, etc., we need to be aware of the fact that not everyone took the same role in what happened. So for me, it's always, what are you doing with the light that comes after the darkness? You always have a choice.
Thank you so much to all of you, Elma, Zorica, and Zilka, for both your excellent presentations from which we learned so much about peace building in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but peace building in general, about the importance, the centrality of women in the process, of what women contribute to peace building, what they demand in the process. We're so grateful to you for being with us today, and thanks to all those who were attending this morning's session. We'll take a break at this point for about 15 minutes, and we'll reconvene at 10:45 for our next session. So again, thanks to everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So welcome back to everyone for our final session, which is the keynote address by Dr. Andrea Matačić Cayley. Did I pronounce your name correct, Andrea?
Matačić, yeah.
Yes. So Dr. Cayley is the executive director of the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law in Washington, D.C. programs at the University of Arizona. These programs include the International Rule of Law and Security, Government Law and Public Service, Antitrust Law, and the Indian Law program. Andrea began her career as a legal researcher for Human Rights Watch while in law school. She worked for 2 decades as a lawyer with the United Nations, serving as UN liaison officer to the U.S. Congress. Then spent 15 years in The Hague working in the office of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and 4 years in Cambodia working on prosecutions of the Khmer Rouge. Andrea was the director of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law and associate dean for special projects at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. She worked on domestic prosecutions of war crimes as a senior legal fellow for the Center of Justice and Accountability and as the U.S. country coordinator of Civitas Maxima. As a senior non-resident fellow at the McCain Institute, she led a U.S.-Russia Foundation grant training Russian civil society on legal venues to prosecute human rights violations. Andrea is the coordinator of and expert consultant to the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group for Ukraine, the ACA, which is the official US, UK, EU response to war crimes in Ukraine. Andrea has published numerous articles concerning the prosecution of war crimes and human rights violations, and has taught international human rights at the University of Pennsylvania and Villanova Law School. She currently serves an advisor to NATO on the protection of cultural property during armed conflict and leads cultural heritage accountability for ACA. In 2023, Andrea drafted the Memorandum of Understanding between ASU Law, Penn Global, and the University of Copenhagen to create the Heritage Warfare Consortium, which is a multidisciplinary project to protect cultural heritage and hold accountable those responsible for the destruction of cultural heritage. Andrea serves as the co-chair of the American Society of International Law's Transitional Justice and Rule of Law Interest Group. The topic of Dr. Cayley's talk today is the international law and transitional justice as elements of peace building. Her title for her paper, her address, is Justice in War, the Path to Transitional Justice in the Former Yugoslavia and Ukraine. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrea Matačić Cayley. We look forward to hearing from you today. I'm very pleased that you can be with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Beyer, Jerry. We began to collaborate during COVID, so unfortunately we've never met in person, but I sincerely look forward to the day that we do meet. I want to start first by thanking you for organizing this panel during such a historically significant period, the anniversary of the 30th Rwandan massacre, and in July of next year, the 30th anniversary of the Srebrenica massacre. I additionally want to thank you for creating this 2-day discussion that is centered on speakers, wonderfully mainly women, who have ethnic ties to these regions. It is oftentimes fears of bias, most frequently completely unwarranted, that silence the voices of those who know the region and the issues best. I'm going to discuss this morning a very topical subject, the role of international law, international courts in peace building. I will start by discussing the war in Yugoslavia, the formation of the ICTY, but I will conclude with Ukraine, a place that stands out in legal history as a conflict where in the midst of war, for the very first time, there's an active, multidimensional, sponsored push for transitional justice. The war in Yugoslavia began in the spring of 1991 and raged until the end of 1995. Unlike the continual exposure to images that social media has brought to the conflicts in Ukraine and Israel and Gaza, the Yugoslav war was only shown on our evening news and in newspaper print. And I'm quickly just going to pull up a slide, if that's okay. Just. So this is a slide this is a photograph from Time magazine that appeared in August of 1992. And it depicts on the right side a Bosnian Muslim who was held in a camp outside of in Bosnia, in Ternopilja. And the one on the left is in an Austrian camp. These horrific, shocking images were the first time that in 50 years that concentration camps had been seen in Europe, and this horror had been seen in Europe. This galvanized public opinion, much in the way that currently social media is pushing and getting the support of young people to support U.S. Financing and military and social support in Ukraine. The Bosnian camp was Ternopilja, and the photograph taken in May of 1945 was a camp called Ebensee in Austria. The call came from people in the US and Europe for some action, the decision not to act militarily by any country. In fact, to embargo and sanction any arms sales to any of the republics left all of the regions at the mercy of the well-armed Yugoslav army, which was now under the control of Serbia and President Milosevic. Jeez. The desire for countries to avoid entering militarily was countered by calls to respond to images of concentration camps, shelled cities, and civilians lying dead in city centers, images that had not been seen in Europe for 50 years. The solution that the international community and the UN came up with was to create a court to prosecute those liable for committing the same crimes that had been prosecuted in Nuremberg. The UN had sent a commission headed by legal scholar Sharif Basuni to begin collecting and documenting the crimes occurring in the former Yugoslavia. His report and his extensive collection formed the basis of what would become the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY. In 1993, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 827, establishing the ICTY. It had jurisdiction over 4 clusters of crimes committed on the territory of the former Yugoslavia since 1991. Grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, violations of the laws or customs of war, genocide and crimes against humanity. The maximum sentence that it could impose was life imprisonment. This was the first time that a tribunal was established during an armed conflict, not post, like Nuremberg, to prosecute crimes occurring while the crimes were being committed. Without realizing it, the international community, by creating the ICTY, took the first steps towards transitional justice in the former Yugoslavia. The ICTY first opened its doors in the summer of 1994. It was fully staffed by seconded lawyers and investigators, meaning lawyers on loan from their governments. The legal staff was predominantly from the Department of Justice and the Chief of Investigations from Australia. So this was a heavily common law trained group that began to address legal recourse in a civil law country, in civil law countries, in fact, by that point. I can discuss the issues and problems with this later if there's any interest. In August 1994, the UN appointed Richard Goldstone as the first prosecutor. Goldstone was not unfamiliar with conflict. He had been close to Nelson Mandela and headed the Goldstone Commission. The commission's mandate was both to investigate the causes of the violence in South Africa and to recommend measures to contain or prevent it. The commission was the first step in transitional justice for South Africa, to be followed later in 1995 with the establishment of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Goldstone came to the ICTY with this transitional justice background and accepted the role that the international community gave him, established the facts, punish the perpetrators of international crimes, and participate in maintaining peace as well as repairing the effects of the crimes. In all these things, the ICTY has had both real successes and failures. As Judge Patricia Wald, one of the first judges of the court, said, the ICTY is performing three functions: adjudicating international crimes, developing international humanitarian law, and memorializing important, albeit horrible, events of modern history. When I joined the ICTY at the start of 1995, the entire office of the prosecutor fit into one large room. By the time I left, 15 years later, the end of 2010, the office of the prosecutor filled 3 floors of a large building. The tribunal grew over those 15 years and achieved more indictments, arrests, and trials than anyone ever could have imagined. The ICTY was ordered by the United Nations to investigate and prosecute each of the ethnic groups equally. When I arrived to the ICTY, a CIA, and this was prior to my arrival, so it was at the end of 1994, a CIA report on war crimes in Yugoslavia had just been leaked. It estimated that over 90% of the crimes had been committed by forces aligned with Serbia. On my first days as a very young lawyer in the ICTY, I mentioned this report. I asked why weren't the investigations being built around it. My comments were rebuffed, and the order was to create, and I was told that the order by the UN was to create equal numbers of investigatory teams. So teams led by investigators with 2 lawyers, a number of investigators, and an analyst were created. One to investigate Serbian forces, a few others to investigate Bosnian Serb forces, another bunch to investigate Croatian forces, then some lawyers and investigators looking at Bosnian Croat forces and Bosnian Muslim forces. Later on, we opened it and began investigating Kosovar crimes, the KLA's crimes. The prosecution staff were therefore themselves divided on ethnic grounds. This created an almost surreal atmosphere where, for example, an Australian investigator was fully behind the idea that Bosnian Croats were responsible and to blame for all of the crimes in Yugoslavia, while perhaps a French one may have blamed it all on the Serbs. Going forward in investigating and prosecuting war crimes, it must be essential in all investigations to focus on the region, on the crimes that occurred, and not on investigating ethnic groups. Despite these issues, the tribunal had its first success when a low-level Bosnian Serb camp guard named Duško Tadić, who had been arrested in Germany, was handed over to the ICTY. He faced 12 counts of crimes against humanity, 12 counts of grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, and 10 counts of violations of the customs of war, to all of which he pleaded not guilty. Tadić's defense argument was that the court was illegitimately created through the United Nations Security Council. His argument was based upon the separation of powers. He essentially argued that the Security Council was an executive governmental branch and thus did not have the power to create a judicial body, and that an international body could not judge the crimes on the territory of the former Yugoslavia. To resolve this argument, the court was forced to determine by itself whether it was legitimately formed through the United Nations Security Council. The decision by the appeals chamber in Tadić represents an important development in the field of international humanitarian law. The Tadić decision is significant because it addresses the validity of the creation of an international criminal tribunal by the Security Council, the first such tribunal ever constituted by the global community through the United Nations. The court found that it did indeed have the legal authority, the jurisdiction to try war crimes under international law. On May 7th, 1997, the trial chamber found Tadić guilty on 9 counts and partially guilty on 2 counts. The Tadić case established the legal basis and jurisdiction of the court, and it showed the world that the crimes that were happening in the former Yugoslavia were going to be prosecuted. This small, from all appearances, inconsequential case was the start of a revolution in international law. It cemented the legal basis for international courts to prosecute and punish war crimes. However, this case also refocused the office of the prosecutor. The OTP wanted to make clear to the world that it was not a court that was going to be focused on low-level camp commanders. It was going to go after the most senior military and political leaders in the former Yugoslavia. This case shifted the focus of the ICTY. The ICTY upheld this mandate given to it by the UN and focused its work investigating equally the most senior political and military figures in the former Yugoslavia. There were open investigations not just into President Slobodan Milošević, but also Presidents Franjo Tuđman and President Alija Izetbegović, as well as their highest military and political officials. One of the essential messages that the ICTY failed to get through to the communities in the former Yugoslavia was that there was equity in investigations. This without doubt impeded the ICTY as a mechanism of transitional justice. In fact, the investigation into Franjo Tuđman, the president of Croatia, for crimes committed by Bosnian Croat soldiers in Bosnia was legally much stronger than the one opened against Slobodan Milošević. This leads me to the other obstacle in achieving transitional justice through an international court, especially a UN-controlled one, and that is politics. From the demand in equity in investigations by the UN to the push for a quick indictment of Slobodan Milošević upon his arrest, the minute that politics enter the courtroom, justice can be impeded. The Milošević case, without doubt, proved to be one of the most controversial trials in modern history. From the rushed indictment after his arrest to the strategy that the ICTY took in prosecuting Milošević, the effects on the legacy of the court were lasting. The chief prosecutor on the case, Jeffrey Nice, was pulled between 2 camps. U.S. prosecutors advised him to prosecute Milošević for 3 symbolic cases: Vukovar, Sarajevo, and Kosovo. European prosecutors and analysts pushed for an indictment that encompassed all crimes on the territory of the former Yugoslavia. So while the US wanted this focus of a symbolic case in each region, the international, the European, and many of the analysts at the court pushed for a full investigation and prosecution of all crimes that could be linked to the JNA and then to the Bosnian Serb army. Mr. Nice chose the second option for the prosecution cases and began a long and unwieldy prosecution case that covered already prosecuted cases and new cases committed by the Yugoslav army in Croatia, Bosnia, and added in more cases for Kosovo. This enormous prosecution, which brought in almost the entire staff from the ICTY, pulling them from other cases, would have lasted years and years had Milošević not died. The effect of this extends beyond the budget and the staffing of the ICTY and directly impacted the victims. Victims who had testified in cases years before, witnessing the murder of family victims or survivors of sexual violence, were brought back, and many re-traumatized to testify again about the same crimes over and over. Since the ICTY post-Tadić had focused on building cases against leaders, victims of war crimes were testifying against senior politicians or military commanders, not against their actual rapist or perpetrator. Oftentimes, after testifying 2 or 3 times at the ICTY about the crime that they had endured, They would return to their villages and encounter the actual perpetrator of the crime, who, because of his low military or political stature, would never be prosecuted at the ICTY. The Milosevic trial would have lasted longer than most cases at the ICTY, but the cases were long. The average length of a trial was measured in years, not months. The complexity of the cases, the scheduling of witnesses from all over the world, translators, bringing them in, scheduling them, and the bureaucracy of the UN led to criticism from locals as well as internationals. The ICTY had originally predicted that it would finish all trials and appeals by 2008. In fact, the ICTY issued its last final appeal decision in May of 2023, last year. While this speaks to the lengths of the trials of the ICTY, it also speaks to its successes. As I mentioned in early 1995, when we had begun to investigate crimes and draft indictments, no one at the ICTY believed that there would be a single person arrested and brought to The Hague. However, by the end of the ICTY's term, it had indicted 161 people and convicted 92. After my time at the ICTY, I did have the honor to work at the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, known as the ECCC, the court prosecuting the Khmer Rouge. Because of this, I can identify one stark contrast that without doubt limited the effectiveness of the ICTY to provide transitional justice. The ICTY was housed in a large former insurance building that had been completely reconfigured with Dutch electronics from Philips, brand new high-tech courtrooms where you could listen to trials in 4 different languages. The courtroom was in The Hague, 1,088 miles from Sarajevo. The courtroom was almost always completely empty. The exception was when large case decisions were handed down and the courts would fill with journalists and people, families from the former Yugoslavia. The judges and most of the staff were internationals. Many of the interpreters were from former Yugoslavia. There was a reluctance and suspicion of anybody with an ethnic name. As a recent law graduate with a very ethnic name, I was somehow hired. However, for the most of my early career at the ICTY, I was never allowed to be present physically in the courtroom. There was a definite separation at the ICTY of the ethnics and the internationals. The ICTY was most clearly a court where the internationals were deciding justice for the ethnics. With time, this did begin to change, and in about 2006, a young, brilliant, I believe Croatian or Bosnian female lawyer, of course, born and raised in the US, was assigned to work on the Srebrenica case. The distinction that was at the heart of the ICTY structure, which excluded and separated the very communities it should have been including and strengthening. This is why, as I said at the start, this conference yesterday and today is so significant, as it's asking to hear the voice of the quote unquote ethnics, the voices of those who know the region and the issues best. In contrast, the ECCC, the Cambodian court, was a hybrid court, meaning it had 2 parallel structures from the prosecutor down, all the way down from the international side and a local Cambodian side. So you had a Cambodian prosecutor, chief prosecutor, and an international chief prosecutor. You had analysts, Cambodian, equal numbers of internationals, security guards, secretaries. The entire staff was duplicated in international and in local Cambodian staff. The court was based outside of Phnom Penh, so in the region. And every single day, without doubt, without any break in court, the court was packed with people. You would see monks coming from the countryside on their scooters to hear what had happened, families coming from Phnom Penh, from villages all over to hear what had happened to their families and friends, even though the crimes had occurred over 30 years ago. There is no question that the effect of transitional justice on the community, even though delayed by decades, was more direct and impactful on individuals in Cambodia than in Bosnia. The ICTY, established in the midst of war, was, as I said earlier, intended to not just prosecute war criminals, but aid in ending the war. The hope was that the fear of prosecutions would stop war crimes from happening. In fact, the tribunal had been open for a year and was fully functioning when in July of 1995, 8,000 Bosnian men were killed by Bosnian Serb forces. I will never forget that day in July as I sat in a large open office area that I heard distressing shouts from a colleague who was a US military analyst. She had received satellite footage that showed execution sites and the mounds covering mass graves. The horror on her face, the agitation, her frenzied zigzagging in and out of offices was something we had never seen before at the ICTY. It was a day or two later that we learned about Srebrenica and what had happened there. Again, the ICTY had its doors open and its beautiful high-tech courtrooms fully functional when the worst atrocity of the war occurred. And now I'm going to just briefly show some slides of what my colleague had seen that day. So you can see here, and in the right-hand corner is blown up footage of Bosnian men being pulled away and grouped outside of Srebrenica before they were executed. And here you can see the mounds. Diggers had come from Serbia to assist in burying and attempting, I assume, to hide the bodies of the murdered Bosnian Muslim men. And this is after the ICTY had begun forensic examinations in the grave and had begun gathering evidence and collecting DNA data of those who had been murdered. And this is one photo of a man who had his arms tied behind his body and had been blindfolded before he had been shot. That crimes took years to investigate and prosecute. Srebrenica was investigated and prosecuted for almost a decade. Those first lawyers and investigators who I knew well, in fact, the French investigator who had to argue and fight to get the Office of the Prosecutor to begin and open this brand new investigation and justify why we had to be there, is memorable to me. However, those first lawyers and investigators who went into those grave sites were never the same. The secondary trauma left most of them with addiction issues and broken families. The massacre at Srebrenica is the one incident that the judges of the ICTY found met the difficult standard that genocide requires. Later on in 2007, when Bosnia sued Serbia at the International Court of Justice, again, it was reinforced and it was found by the ICJ that this massacre at Srebrenica was genocide. While the existence of the ICTY did fail to prevent Srebrenica from happening, its existence did fail to prevent Srebrenica from happening. Its existence did ensure an investigation and the prosecution of numerous Bosnian Serb military and political leaders, including Ratko Mladić and Radovan Karadžić. One of the most significant contributions that the ICTY could make towards transitional justice would be to not only have found individuals responsible for crimes, but to create a permanent historical record. And now I'm going to begin to echo Dr. Maros's beautiful presentation this morning. Historical narratives pose one of the most challenging obstacles to peaceful resolutions of conflicts and reconciliation. Narratives of conflict typically emphasize one of the group's suffering, morality, and the justice of the one group's goals and actions, while delegitimizing the opponent. For instance, each group's account of the history of the conflict highlights different events and interprets the same events differently. Typically, each group in conflict blames the opponent for the violence. Narratives of historical events are often manipulated by leaders and elites to justify aggressive action towards the other group. In this manner, historical memory might provide lessons that are not conducive to peace building and become a basis for the continuation of conflict. The two groups' conflicting views of the past have negative consequences for coexistence and reconciliation and might provoke new hostilities and violence. Because of the role of history in fueling new conflicts and impeding reconciliation between groups, addressing the history of conflict is considered important and essential for transitional justice and finally for reconciliation. Reconciliation requires a change in the orientation by groups towards the previous enemy, including acceptance of the other's facts. Such acceptance requires addressing and coming to terms with a conflictual and violent past by mutually acknowledging past suffering. This effort, through memorialization, aims to deal with the history of the conflict in order to promote peace. The ICTY, in its 30 years of existence, created the largest repository of historical documentation from the war in Yugoslavia. From statements to evidence, almost everything is available and serves as a record of the conflict and the measures taken to get that accountability for war crimes. There are, of course, and this is essential to note, materials that those of us who worked at the court were able to see but are not available. The giant transcripts of recorded Nixon-like conversations that took place in President Tudjman's office. Many don't know all of his meetings and everything that occurred in his office was recorded. And the president who came in after him gave the ICTY full access to those recordings. The military intercepts, for example, are not available. Those were gathered and they were available in different international governments' offices and also in one of the national government offices. Intercepts are recorded conversations between military leaders, as well as between military and political leaders and between political leaders. Those are not available in the ICTY archive. And finally, although there are more, the most significant one are the secret recordings of the Serbian Supreme Command, where they planned and discussed many of the operations that led to war crimes. These documents to this day are not available for the public to review. And this is, again, something that should be looked at in the future. However, all of the trial records of all 161 indicted individuals are at the ICTY. The ICTY is now renamed the Residual Mechanism and are available in The Hague, and eventually they'll be searchable online. Again, while The Hague is central to the legacy of the ICTY and to international justice, it is my opinion that these materials, this database, should all be based in the former Yugoslavia so that there can be ownership of memorialization and transitional justice by the local population, by the victims and the people who've been affected by the crimes and who live with the legacy of these crimes. With the ICTY record, this fixed, determined set of facts, there is still in Republika Srpska and in parts of Serbia, complete denial that Srebrenica ever happened, of any war crimes where the Serbs were responsible ever happening. One can say that the same thing happened with the denial of the Holocaust, even though the records of Nuremberg are available. As far as the ICTY could, it recorded history and preserved a final record. Looking at each of the republics that were distinctly affected by the war and examined by the ICTY, we can also see a distinct difference in how successful they transitioned out of war. There is no doubt that Croatia, now a successful though not perfect democracy with a functioning judiciary and legislature, can be considered a successful example of transitional justice. Croatia, in 1994, when the ICTY first opened its doors, then president and government's opinion was that it was a victim of the war and any military actions that it took were defensive. Croatia opened its doors willingly to the ICTY, believing that the ICTY would focus on its victimhood and would show to the world what it had suffered. To its surprise, Croatia began itself to be investigated for the commission of war crimes. As I mentioned earlier this morning, Croatian military and political support and its control of the Bosnian Croat military was established very early on in 1995. During the riot, it was a pre-trial hearing of a man called Ivica Rajić for a massacre in a place called Stupni Do. A Rule 54 hearing took place to determine whether a case was present and whether the prosecution could go forward. The judges demanded clarity on whether the conflict in Yugoslavia was an international or a civil armed conflict. In order to prove the international elements of the crime, the prosecutors established dates of Croatian recognition. So Croatia was recognized as an independent state separate from Bosnia. And its proof, and the prosecutors went on to establish proof of its involvement as an outside state in the crimes in Bosnia. So very early on, the chain of political and military command from Zagreb to soldiers in Mostar and central Bosnia was established. And as I said earlier, an investigation and draft indictment of the sitting president existed, but was never issued. That lens on actions that the government in Croatia had taken and the crimes that they were linked to was placed on them very early on. However, this is not the only reason that Croatia was able to succeed more rapidly than the other republics. Croatia, as a candidate for NATO and EU membership, desperately wanted in. It had seen other countries that it thought itself more developed economically and politically, such as Hungary, Bulgaria, go into the EU. Without any doubt, Croatia cooperated with the ICTY more fully than, say, Serbia because of the pressure of EU and NATO. That pressure that EU and NATO put on Croatia to hand over indictees and to support the ICTY investigations. The longer membership was delayed, the more desperate and amenable to the ICTY Croatia became. The desire to join the EU also forced Croatia to look at other domestic government structures and weed out internal corruption. This led to the indictment and conviction of their Prime Minister, Ivo Sanader, for corruption. The light that EU and NATO forced Croatia to shine on its own structures. This included redrafting parts of its constitution, taking into account its minorities, as well as taking into account its past crimes. Without doubt, allowed Croatia to transition to a more stable and democratic country than they ever would have been without the ICTY or the EU. Membership in the EU and the economic benefits that come with accession to the EU also pushed Croatia ahead of the other republics. Bosnia, because of the continued division into Bosnian Republic of Muslims and Croats and the separate Serbian entity being allowed to exist, Republika Srpska, even post-Dayton, cannot be considered in the same context. The ICTY did assist the development of transitional justice in Bosnia more than is acknowledged or recognized. The majority of prosecutions of Croats, Bosnians, and Serbs occurred on the territory of Bosnia, where the worst of the conflict had raged. While, as I have mentioned, there is denial by Bosnian Serbs and by some Serbs of some of the crimes, The evidence put forward has created a repository that has set the record straight. One of the rarely discussed successes in establishing transitional justice in Bosnia was an American Bar Association project called The Rules of the Road. As I mentioned, the ICTY focused its work on indicting the most senior military and political leaders, and after the Tadić case, it did not pursue lower-level indictments. What happened to all of the evidence, these lower-level indictees, against all of these lower-level indictees? Much of it had been handed over by different European countries to the ICTY. Much had been gathered during investigations that the ICTY had on the ground in Bosnia. What happened was that the ABA sent lawyers to the ICTY, where this information and caseloads were gathered. The ABA organized the American Bar Association organized the transfer of these cases to Bosnia, and then assisted in 2005 the Office of the High Representative in establishing the Bosnian War Crimes Chamber in the courts of Bosnia and Herzegovina. This hybrid court is more similar to the ECCC, the Cambodian court, than to the ICTY. 1 year after the adoption of the plan, a separate ad hoc working group started drafting a transitional justice strategy, which was finalized but never adopted by the Council of Ministers of the Bosnian government, mostly due to the disagreement of political parties representing the three main ethnic groups of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The transitional justice strategy was supposed to complement the war crime strategy. It aimed at creating a sustainable platform for establishing facts about the past and by developing a never again, as one of my colleagues this morning mentioned, mentality. It sought to prevent the reoccurrence of conflict. After the initial years, however, war crime strategy had to be revised. It was clear that at the existing pace, it was not possible to meet its ambitious goals and deadlines. In April 2017, the Council of Ministers tasked a working group for the purpose of drafting changes and amendments to the strategy. The working group completed its work in May of 2018, providing a revised national strategy for war crimes processing. The revised strategy acknowledged the fact that the initial deadline had passed already, and it set the completion of all cases in Bosnia and Herzegovina, including the most complex ones, by the end of 2023. This ambitious plan of domestic prosecutions and transitional justice, while naming thousands of perpetrators of war crimes, has moved slowly in bringing cases and has been weighed down with the national biases that created the war. However, I would not consider it a failure. Without this court, all of those indictees considered too low-ranking for ICTY prosecutions would most likely never had to answer for their crimes. Those victims who were forced to face the criminals who had perpetrated crimes on them were now given a tool to prosecute them. So their testimony in front of the ICTY for Milosevic or for Mladic was now able to be concretely prosecuted against the individual, the actual individual who perpetrated the crime against them. In the majority of the regions where the International Criminal Court in The Hague, another large body that has grown out of the Nuremberg and ICTY, ICTR legacy, the ICC has investigated and prosecuted cases all over the world. However, the ICC also only indicts the most senior political or military figures, and that is it. A hybrid local mechanism does not exist in most cases to handle the lower level perpetrators. The creation of domestic war crimes courts is essential if all the perpetrators, high level or low level, are to be held accountable. And that is something that other courts going forward, such as the ICC, must consider, what their legacy and what the prosecutions will be like in the countries once the senior level people are prosecuted in The Hague. Finally, not only does the continued division of Bosnia and Herzegovina work against establishing transitional justice, the continued support that Republika Srpska receives from Serbia and Russia cripples any attempts for justice. Russia has been supplying Republika Srpska with arms from the time of the war to the present. To this day, they are training and arming Serbian paramilitaries and police forces, Bosnian Serbian paramilitaries and police forces. As late as 4 months ago, in January of this year, January 8th, 2024, U.S. Air Force F-16s flew over Bosnia and Herzegovina in a show of force aimed at deterring secessionist activity by Bosnian Serbs that is at odds with the U.S.-brokered peace accords from Dayton. I will turn now to Serbia and the effects of the ICTY on transitional justice there. Sadly, here too, the ICTY has had little direct impact on Serb leaders and political parties, the rule of law, or on civil society. What impact the court has had has been indirect, the product of a network of other actors like the United States and the European Union. Without a doubt, Serbia has an exceptionally strong civil society. Without the brave individuals like Nataša Kandić and many, many others, the ICTY never could have prosecuted leaders like Slobodan Milošević. However, the dominant opinion in Serbia has been to blame the ICTY for being anti-Serb and biased in their prosecutions, even though the ICTY had a stated goal, and I can attest, having spent 15 years there, to balance their investigations and prosecutions evenly across all ethnic groups. One significant failure that the ICTY made with Serbia was not to begin earlier, like it did in the Croatian and Bosnian Croat cases, looking at the links between Bosnian Serb politicians and military figures and Serbian military and government structures. Bizarrely, for example, the Srebrenica massacre was led by Ratko Mladić, a man collecting a Yugoslav army pension, a former Yugoslav army soldier, communicating daily with the former head of the Yugoslav army, Momčilo Perišić, while in Bosnia. And no point was a case built looking at Serbia's direct or indirect involvement in that genocide. And I've already mentioned all of the diggers and trucks that came from Serbia to Srebrenica to help cover up that massacre. The fact that the majority of the ICTY cases treated the Bosnian Serbs as an independent entity from Serbia allowed Serbia to escape the direct examination, and a light was not shown on it on the way that Croatia was forced to examine its own involvement and support for the crimes in Bosnia, and this is speaking other than the Milošević case. In order to try war crimes cases in national courts, Serbia established a war crimes chamber in July of 2003. It did this with the support of the United States government and the ICTY. This was 3 years after the ousting of Serbia's wartime leader, Slobodan Milošević. At that time, the new authorities in Belgrade were eager to regain international credibility after the conflicts of the 1990s, when Serbia faced sanctions and international isolation. The transition was, however, incomplete. It relied on an uneasy and unstable political coalition. Large parts of the security sector, including the police, armed forces, and internal security services, were not touched by the reforms, and they enjoyed the support of some of the new political actors. Large sections of Serbian society believed that Serbia had been the victim of external forces who conspired together to break up Yugoslavia. Due to the lack of media freedom, there was little or no knowledge of the crimes committed by the separatist Serb republics in Bosnia and Croatia, or by the Serbian forces in Kosovo. The domestic prosecution of war crimes was directly affected by internal power dynamics in Serbia. The whole process can be divided into those two distinct phases. The first phase, covering the period between 2003 and 2015, when 60 indictments were filed and a total of 162 persons were charged, which resulted in 41 cases and 49 different trials. Out of those cases, 27 trials were completed, resulting in conviction of about 60% of the defendants. The remaining trials were pending either in first or second instance. After a shift in power, and Alexander Vučić, the current president of Serbia, and the former Minister of Information for Slobodan Milošević took power. The prosecution of war crimes cases became more, as one local journalist in Belgrade said, it became like ticking boxes to please the European Union. Serbia walks the line between the European Union and still being extremely close with Russia. In fact, the first place that Sergei Lavrov, the Russian minister, visited after the invasion of Ukraine was Belgrade. While Serbia is a candidate for membership in the European Union, before it joins the bloc, the European Union has given it a mandate. It must first reform the judiciary, the rule of law, and media freedoms, and root out corruption, organized crime. The EU has demanded that it must also mend ties with Kosovo and align its foreign policies with those of the EU, including the introduction of sanctions against Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. The continued involvement and support by Russia in Serbia counters any sort of carrot-stick relationship that could have developed between Serbia and the EU or NATO, the way it did with Croatia. In January of this year, sadly, very barely reported anywhere in the international media, the streets of Belgrade were filled with protesters who demanded the annulment of elections that international observers described as riddled with severe fraud, in order to deny opposition figures places in parliament. I managed to watch most of the protests and the speeches online, and one sentence echoed through the speeches: "We are the people who rejected Milošević and sent him to The Hague. We need your support." Again, civil society is strong in Serbia, and it is essential that the US and international community provide it with the support it needs. While Kosovo was the first region that experienced the human rights abuses of the Milošević regime and was the focus of the first Milošević indictment, it also was examined by the ICTY for crimes committed by the Kosovo Liberation Army. The ICTY indicted 6 Kosovars. 2 were convicted and 4 were acquitted. Post-war, Kosovo had the presence of NATO forces for military security, KFOR, UNMIK, and ULEX, a European Union civil security force established to strengthen the rule of law. In addition, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, opened offices in Kosovo, including an office dealing specifically and only with transitional justice. Additionally, in September 2011, the European Union decided to set up a special investigative task force to further investigation into allegations contained in the Council of Europe report by Dick Marty, a Swiss minister, alleging crimes by the KLA, including continued crimes by the KLA, past the dates that the ICTY had been examining, specifically alleging organ trafficking by the KLA. That was never proven. In summer of 2014, the task force did announce that the evidence investigated was sufficient to open an indictment. In order to address these allegations, there had to be an adequate institution for proper judicial proceedings. So the Kosovo authorities have agreed with the EU on modalities of dealing with these serious allegations. So the allegations with their continued abuses by the Kosovo Liberation Army, its members, against Serbs in Kosovo. On the 3rd of August 2015, the Kosovo Assembly adopted Article 162 of the Kosovo Constitution, and the law on the Specialist Chambers and Specialist Prosecutor's Office was passed. The specialist chambers are attached to each level of the court system in Kosovo: Basic Court, Court of Appeals, Supreme Court, and Constitutional Court, and function according to relevant Kosovo laws, as well as customary international human rights law. ULEX supports the specialist chambers and specialist prosecutor's office with logistical and operational support in line with the relevant Kosovo legislation. The body of this court, however, is based in The Hague and has indicted a number of Kosovar politicians and military figures, including a case that's ongoing right now, the former Prime Minister of Kosovo, Hashim Thaçi. This is an extremely controversial court, as it is only looking to investigate and prosecute Kosovars, and Kosovars only. There's numerous rumors around why this court was established and whether it will have any effect. However, one thing that it has done is that it has positively integrated international legal standards into the courts in Kosovo and addressed specifically the significant issue of corruption in Kosovo. Surprisingly, with all of the international effort in Kosovo, this January was the first time that the Ministry of Justice approved a transitional justice strategy, almost a quarter of a century since the war ended. Many issues stemming from the conflict persist today. These include impunity for war crimes, missing persons who have not yet been found, and this is both of Serbian individuals as well as Kosovar individuals. There's so much disagreement between the two sides that they can't even hand over bodies that are found or register the missing persons on either side. People displaced from their homes have not yet been able to return, and unpunished human rights violations and enduring ethnic divisions. The Kosovo authorities believe that transitional justice mechanisms can address some of these issues. The idea of setting up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to establish the facts about the conflict has now been folded into this new transitional justice strategy. A main objective of the transitional justice strategy is strengthening the prosecutorial and judicial system and increasing the number of police officers investigating war crimes cases, as well as improving the country's witness protection program. The final document also includes the creation of a database for crimes under international law at the Kosovo Special Prosecutor's Office. One thing to note is that in establishment of that court in The Hague, prior to its opening, lists and lists of protected witnesses who were working with the EU and with this newly established chamber were released in the media. In an effort to tackle impunity for war crimes, Kosovo changed its code of criminal procedure to allow suspects to be indicted even when they are not available to the Kosovo judicial authorities because they do not live in the country. Because it does not recognize Kosovo's independence, Serbia does not extradite suspects to its former province. So anyone indicted in Kosovo can live freely in Serbia. As many of you know, in the fall of last year, tensions between Kosovar Serbs and Albanians were so heightened that there was fear of all-out war between the two countries. Like with Bosnia, the struggle for transitional justice is significant when there is a threat of renewed violence. Kosovo is symbolic as the place where the conflict in Yugoslavia started. From Milosevic's speech in 1989, commemorating 600 years of the Battle of Kosovo that the Serbs lost, which inflamed and incited and spoke of Serbian superiority in the former Yugoslavia, is also symbolic for Vladimir Putin. The actions that NATO took and its presence in Kosovo altered Russian and international relations forever. I lived in Croatia at the time of the speech in 1989 that Milosevic gave, and I sat with Croatian and Serbian friends in Zagreb watching that speech in silence as it interrupted the weekly Sunday movie. And I also was in The Hague in March of 1999 when NATO, led by the United States, launched an air war aimed at forcing the Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic to put an end to anti-Albanian violence in the province of Kosovo and to withdraw Serbian military and police from the region. Both times, there was an unreal awareness that something was about to change. In The Hague, my upstairs neighbor was an official in the Russian embassy. After hearing about the NATO bombing, in my mind, I was walking home thinking, finally, this will put an end to this war. When I ran into my neighbor going on the lift upstairs, he had a very different reaction, a very, very different reaction. He said to me, "You really don't understand. Everything has changed. This is very bad." He was completely shocked and stunned and was reeling from the NATO strikes. I do not think at any point I realized what he meant until right before the Russian attack on Ukraine. Now I'm going to share one photo that's not right before the attack on Ukraine, during a press conference that followed Putin's talk with Germany's chancellor, a German journalist asked Putin, "Will there be a war in Europe? Can you rule out the possibility of a war in Europe?" Putin answered, "Mr. Chancellor just said that people of his generation, and I am a member of his generation, can hardly imagine any kind of war in Europe. But you and I have witnessed a war in Europe, the war against Yugoslavia, which was unleashed coincidentally by NATO. It was a large-scale military operation that included airstrikes against a European capital, Belgrade. That happened, didn't it?" When NATO launched the airstrikes on Belgrade, they did not inform Russia. Yevgeny Primakov, the Russian prime minister at the time, was on his way to the United States when he learned of the attacks. He was told by Vice President Al Gore that the strikes were inevitable and Russia didn't have a say in the matter. Primakov had his plane turned around over the Atlantic and returned to Moscow. This ended the era of cooperation and aspirational friendship between Russia, NATO, and the US that had begun after the Cold War. Russians now remember the U-turn over the Atlantic as the first time that post-Soviet Russia asserted its right to be heard. The 78-day air war over Kosovo and Serbia was unprecedented in several ways, since it was undertaken without the sanction of the UN Security Council. Before the bombing campaign had ended, Louise Arbour, the then chief prosecutor for the ICTY, appointed a group to investigate allegations of war crimes committed by NATO. The group documented several instances in which there had been multiple civilian casualties. The Allies had bombed a passenger train, a refugee convoy, a village in Kosovo, and in Belgrade. In Belgrade, the Chinese embassy and the headquarters of Radio Television Serbia. The first four appear to have been mistakes, but the television tower was targeted as a source of Serbian propaganda. By the time the report was completed, Arbour had completed her term at the ICTY. Her successor, Carla Del Ponte, decided not to open a criminal investigation. Russia did not have a direct stake in Kosovo, aside from a brotherhood with the Serbs because they, like Russians, are Eastern Orthodox. In Russian memory, however, the NATO war was an attack on Russia because it showed that Russia no longer mattered. At the end of 1999, Vladimir Putin became the president of Russia. His rise was not determined by the Kosovo Air War, but he rode the wave of resurgent nationalism during it and is consistently drawn from the reservoir of resentment that was deepened by the war. Masha Gessen, the brilliant Russian-American journalist, who, if anybody is interested in these links between an obsession by Putin with Kosovo and NATO's operation there, should read. Masha has said, Putin's protracted campaign of threatening Ukraine looks like a long-delayed tit-for-tat in response to the air war in Kosovo. Masha wrote before the attack on Ukraine, again, I'm quoting Masha, if Putin ultimately stops entertaining Western negotiators and unleashes the big war, the death and misery that it will cause will be his responsibility. But the world in which such a war is possible has been forged jointly by Russia and the United States starting 23 years ago. As Putin moved into Ukraine, he used terms like, I'm sending in peacekeepers. This is a humanitarian action, mockingly applying NATO and UN terminology to his brutal actions. Prior to the attack on Ukraine, I was serving as a senior non-resident legal fellow at the McCain Institute here in Washington, D.C. We just obtained a grant from the Russia America Foundation, and I was training Russian civil society and human rights defenders on how to bring cases for human rights violations in Europe under universal jurisdiction in front of the European Court of Human Rights and in U.S. courts. Among those that I was training were lawyers from Memorial and from Navalny's office. They were at that time residing in Russia, although they were facing persecution. At that time, we drafted a grant application to the State Department to work on the rule of law issues in Ukraine. We obtained that grant from the Office of Global Criminal Justice at State. Within months, the Russians that I worked with had fled Russia, and our grant, which had suddenly become sizably larger, allowed us to be redefined as the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group, ACA, the official US, UK, EU response to war crimes in Ukraine. This is the first time in history that the international community is not just gathering evidence of war crimes during the armed conflict, the way that Sharif Basuni and his brave researchers and lawyers did, but assisting in the domestic prosecution of war crimes. ACA is divided into three components, led by the State Department's Ambassador for War Crimes, the Ambassador for Global Criminal Justice, Ambassador Beth Van Skak, a close colleague from my ICTY days. The U.S. legal team is headed by Ambassador Clint Williamson, also a former ICTY prosecutor and a former U.S. War Crimes Ambassador. This group sends U.S. and international lawyers to Kyiv to work directly with the Office of the Prosecutor General. The EU team, headed by Italian Claudio Palla, which is based in Kyiv and supports the prosecutor's office with investigative and legal assistance. The UK team is headed by British lawyer Wayne Jordash, who has innovated war crimes investigations by creating something called mobile justice teams. They go into recently liberated areas in Ukraine, assisting in evidence gathering and legal training on the ground. The support that the embattled Ukrainian government gets allows war crimes prosecutions to be carried out. But the numbers are staggering and overwhelming. The Prosecutor General, Andrei Kostin, has said in February of this year that they are probing 122,000 cases of war crimes. This is on top of the regular crimes that fall under the Office of the Prosecutor General and which must be investigated and prosecuted. In addition to domestic prosecutions, the International Court of Justice, the legal organ of the United Nations, has also been called on to hold Russia accountable. In the last few years, the ICJ has reinvented itself, perhaps prompted by all the action it's been seeing at the ICC to react quicker. Supported by civil society, third parties have brought cases to the ICJ, and the ICJ has begun issuing decisions in days and months rather than in years. It has gone from a stoic, ancient court to one that is playing an active role in deciding pressing and urgent issues like the case that has been brought by Ukraine. In March of 2022, a few months before the launch of ACA, the DC law firm of Covington, acting pro bono on behalf of the government of Ukraine, submitted an application instituting proceedings against the Russian Federation to the ICJ. Covington also submitted on behalf of Ukraine a request for the court to issue provisional measures of protection, including an order for Russia to immediately stop its illegal invasion. By 13 votes to 2, can anyone guess who those 2 votes belong to? The court ordered the Russian Federation to immediately suspend the military operations that it commenced on February 24th, 2022 in the territory of Ukraine, and to ensure that any military or irregular armed units which may be directed or supported by it, as well as any organizations and persons which may be subject to its control or direction, take no steps in furtherance of the military operations which the court ordered to be suspended. Ukraine then pursued its case against the Russian Federation to a judgment on the merits in order to demonstrate that Russia's aggression is based on outrageous and baseless claims of genocide, and to seek full damages for the harm that Russia has caused. On 31 January 2024, the ICJ delivered a landmark judgment in Ukraine v. Russia concerning the application of the International Convention for the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism and the International Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. While the court dismissed most of the allegations presented by the Ukrainian side, the ICJ acknowledged the serious and ongoing violations committed by the Russian Federation, including the failure to investigate terrorism financing and the suppression of Ukrainian language and culture in Crimea. And one thing I'm just going to note as an aside here, when we're talking about terrorism funding by Russia, this is the sort of financing that is still upholding and supporting the Wagner Group, who is committing crimes in Ukraine as well as in Sudan and in other regions of the world. The ICJ, I may have said this, the ICJ acknowledged the serious and ongoing violations committed by the Russian Federation, including the failure to investigate financing and the suppression of Ukrainian culture and language in Crimea. And that suppression and destruction of culture in Ukraine is one of the motives of the Russian operations, clear motives in Ukraine. The court found that the Russian Federation failed to fulfill its obligation under the treaty by not taking adequate measures to investigate the financing of terrorism. Moreover, the court's ruling that the Russian Federation violated certain obligations under the Convention for Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, particularly regarding the educational rights of Ukrainian-speaking community in Crimea, which, while limited, is a significant recognition of the importance of protecting minority rights and cultural identity in these Russian-occupied areas. On February 2nd, 2024, the ICJ rendered its decision on the preliminary objections in the case concerning allegations of genocide under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, so the Genocide Convention. In its judgment, the ICJ unanimously dismissed Russia's procedural objections, ruling that the court can decide on the merits on whether Ukraine or Russia is responsible for committing genocide. However, the ICJ upheld Russia's objections regarding subject matter jurisdiction, ruling that false allegations, as Russia had made against Ukraine, saying that Ukraine was committing genocide in the occupied territories of Crimea, and subsequent use of force do not fall within the scope of the Genocide Convention, and that the ICJ cannot rule on that. So, like with the current Israel-Gaza case, the ICJ has looked at the allegations that Russia's made against Ukraine for committing genocide, but it has not made a decision, as with Israel and Gaza, whether genocide is being committed. The International Criminal Court, the ICC, established by the Rome Statute, has also been significant in pursuing justice in Ukraine. Under its new prosecutor, Karim Khan, a renowned lawyer with exceptional legal skills, they wasted no time in building a war crimes case in Ukraine. While Ukraine was not a signatory to the Rome Statute, it had invited the ICC to investigate in 2014 during the invasion of Crimea. This allowed ICC to open a case in the region. For the first time in ICC history, a seasoned U.S. war crimes prosecutor was taking the lead. Colonel Brenda Hollis, who was brought in to investigate and prosecute the crimes in Ukraine. Prior to Karim becoming prosecutor, U.S. Staff were only allowed if they had a second citizenship or they could be advisors to the court. At this point, under Khan, Brenda Hollis was brought in to investigate and prosecute the crimes in Ukraine. Hollis had been one of those first original U.S. seconded prosecutors at the ICTY that arrived early in the middle of 1994, early in the summer that I had mentioned earlier. She had gone on to be the lead prosecutor for the Sierra Leone Tribunal and Cambodia Court. Together, Khan and Hollis, with their team, on March 17, 2023, issued arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, Commissioner for Children's Rights in the Office of the President, for the war crime of unlawful deportation of population and that of unlawful transfer of population in both cases of children from occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation. These warrants sent a message to the whole world that this was a whole new ICC and that the crimes in Ukraine against the people and culture of Ukraine were being taken seriously. Ukrainian law allows head of state immunity, and the ICC had swept in and taken care of that by issuing the warrant. While many people think that the arrest of Vladimir Putin would be impossible, that is exactly what people thought about Milosevic. Just a month ago, the ICC issued 2 more arrest warrants against Lieutenant General Sergei Koblyazh and Admiral Viktor Sokolov of the Russian armed forces, each allegedly responsible for the war crimes of directing attacks on civilian objects and of causing excessive incidental harm to civilians or damage to civilian objects, as well as the crime against humanity of inhumane acts. These are just the start. The ICC is on the ground and actively investigating the crimes in Ukraine. Colonel Hollis is known for her ability and her willingness to go into war zones and to gather the evidence and work with her teams directly in Ukraine. There is an international group in The Hague, the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression in Ukraine, funded by the US and EU, and they are also examining the best steps to address the crime of aggression and whether to establish an ad hoc ICTY-like court to prosecute these crimes. The ICC is legally only able to investigate the crime of aggression if it is committed by a signatory to the Rome Statute. As Russia is not a signatory, this crime falls outside of the ICC's jurisdiction. Further, justice is being sought by groups like the Clooney Foundation and by Wayne Jordash of ACA, who are working to build universal jurisdiction cases. Universal jurisdiction is the legal theory that a crime is so heinous that it can be universally prosecuted in any court. While the U.S. courts do not allow universal jurisdiction to be used, European courts and some Latin American ones have embraced it. These groups are working to bring cases against Russian war criminals in Europe and in some cases, even in Russia. Finally, the U.S. has issued its first indictment for war crimes in Russia. One of our beloved professors here at ASU Law, a brilliant DOJ lawyer, on December 2023, led the indictment of 4 Russian military personnel. Charges included torture, inhumane treatment, and unlawful confinement of a U.S. national in Ukraine following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. While Ukraine is getting more accountability than any other country ever in history, the question is whether this will lead to transitional justice. Just this year, USAID put out a call for a very large grant focused on building transitional justice in Ukraine. One area that this grant aims to fill is one where there's been a glaring absence: the training of judges and defense lawyers in Ukraine. While the focus has been on building prosecution cases, the truth is that judges in Ukraine have not been trained to deal with war crimes cases. Decisions that are coming out of the courts are weak and oftentimes incorrectly using legal standards or citing to statutes that Ukraine is not even a signatory to. Additionally, defense lawyers who are defending Russians accused of war crimes are petrified. Those defending the alleged war criminals have had threats made to their lives. Not only do the defense lawyers not have the legal training to defend the cases, they are putting their lives at risk taking them on. It is essential that judges get training from international court judges and that international defense lawyers, and if anybody's worked in the international courts, the international defense lawyers are the strongest and most driven people you will ever meet, provide support and legal training to the Ukrainian defense lawyers. This is the only way that these trials will have credibility and assist the process of transitional justice. Finally, if there is truly to be a process of transitional justice in Ukraine, support and assistance must be given to Russian opposition, both inside Russia and to those who are now in exile. Working in Ukraine, it is apparent that there is no interest to partner with Russians, even those who have advocated for change and who have fought for human rights and are now exiled. If the Russians who are demanding more of their leaders and their country and the Serbians who are protesting for democratic elections are not supported, then transitional justice will not be possible either in Ukraine or in the former Yugoslavia. Last year, I attended a conference in Washington, D.C., and I listened to a young Ukrainian journalist speak about the tragedy befalling her country. Prior to the war, she had mainly been writing about and covering the endemic corruption that was crippling Ukraine. She said to the audience that life in Ukraine was a horror, but that her hope was that out of the destruction, a new Ukraine would be born, a modern Ukraine that was democratic and free of corruption. In the end, that is the hope for all of these countries, that they can come out of these horrific and brutal wars, and by pursuing justice, rise like phoenixes out of the hatred, corruption, and violence in which they were mired. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cayley, for sharing your incredible wealth of knowledge and experience with us today. We're deeply grateful. I personally have learned so much from you in this time, this morning and this afternoon. We have a little bit of time left for maybe a question or two. Does anyone have a question from the audience? Feel free to type it into the Q&A box or to raise your hand and we will acknowledge your question by allowing you to speak. I'll take the liberty of asking a question. I have many, many questions that I would like to ask Andrea. In your turn to Ukraine, which I appreciated very much, you anticipated what I wanted to ask about, namely the often repeated claim or assertion that the indictments that have been issued against Vladimir Putin and other Russian either military officials or politicians are essentially kind of empty or vapid because they're not in any way holding these figures accountable, and they're not. There's no hope to bring them to justice in the future, but also they're not in any way serving as a deterrent to further Russian aggression. I heard from you. I think I heard from you that there similar sentiments were expressed about Milosevic. What would need to happen, in your view, in order to bring someone like Putin to justice via an international court, whether it be the ICC or another international court? What would need to happen? What conditions would need to be present for that to happen?
I would say there's two options. One would be that he brazenly flies to some country. For example, he goes to France, to go to the south of France or something. Right there immediately, there's an arrest warrant out for Vladimir Putin. He will be arrested. He was invited to speak in South Africa. South Africa guaranteed that he would not be arrested. He did in the end decide not to go. So he is now confined to Russia. The second, which would be the most beautiful thing if it ever had happened, would be a change in Russia, similar to what happened in Serbia. Slobodan Milosevic was handed over to the ICTY by the Serbs. If there was that sort of change in the political structure, if the opposition got a foothold, if there was a way that those who are now living in Amsterdam or Connecticut or Latvia were able to return and create the democracy that they dream of, I believe that that's something similar, like what happened with Milosevic would happen. And I wouldn't say that they're empty, because they do, these indictments, because they do put pressure on Russia. It's in many ways much like a sanction would, on holding Russia accountable. The negative side and the criticism that I've heard is that it makes any steps towards peace negotiations difficult, because you can't negotiate peace with an indicted war criminal.
Thank you very much. Anyone else have a question, or maybe one of our panelists from today or yesterday, or anyone from the audience? We have just a minute or two. I see Zorica. Go ahead and you can unmute yourself and speak, Zorica.
Yes. No, I wrote, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I wrote just, I don't know if you get this message. I have no question, but I feel need just to express my gratitude for all your work. And thank you for this excellent presentation, although it was, for me personally, a little disturbing seeing all these photos again, but nothing more, Andrea. Just really thanks for all you have done for this country and for what you are doing still.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Zorica. We appreciate that.
And
Anyone else?
I hope we can work together, Zorica, at some point. Transitional justice is such a difficult thing to achieve, and especially in a place like Bosnia, where the division is still so strong.
Yes, I agree. And you are all conviction did by the court in The Hague in our country was perceived as some kind of injustices, at least by one ethnic group or another ethnic group. So it only shows how divided is our society. And as I said, that what the war awakened in people, the powerful cannot so easily calm down. But it is important, this transitional justice, because I am afraid that we are going to repeat everything. And so that is, I cannot even imagine what would happen if the memory of the World War II or even much earlier Kosovo battle was able to mobilize so much people to do what they done during the 19th. What will happen if the memory of the 19th will be repeated? So I don't know if I succeeded to express myself, because as you heard, I have some little trouble with English, but so.
Thank you.
There might be a question in the Q&A. Yes, there is one question. What has been the role of religious leaders on holding offenders accountable, and have they supported the prosecutions or resisted them according to ethnic allegiances?
Oh, so very, I wish I have worked with Catholic nuns in Croatia, in Bosnia, with Caritas, and and also, I mean, the main hero for the removal of landmines in Australia was a Catholic nun, and she's won a Nobel Peace Prize. So I'm not going to slash everything with a black pen, but overall, without any doubt, the religious figures in Bosnia and Croatia seized this opportunity to come out of communism with a roar and rise up and create this anger and hostility and the other religious groups' sentiments. As I said, I was in Zagreb in 1989 getting a master's degree, and it was the first sort of crumblings that I saw of Yugoslavia when it was Christmas and there was a midnight mass in the small St. Mark's church in Zagreb, and it was scary. It was flooded with people, and it wasn't for Jesus's birth and celebrating. It was an expression of waving their Yugoslav Croatian flags, and the everything from watching, the Serbian Orthodox priests blessing Karadzic, and the embracing of the Serbian Orthodox Church by Milosevic, and also by the Russian Orthodox Church by Putin, has been beyond disturbing, and is definitely a tool in manipulating their populations. Sadly, I have not seen, I've only seen, I'll stick with the priests. I won't say anything against the nuns. Anything positive coming out of the churches, and they've in fact been destructive towards transitional justice in the region.
Thank you, Andrea. So I believe we're out of time. Your response to the question reminds us of Father Elise Rutakamba's comment yesterday that religions often play an ambivalent role in the promotion, the building of sustainable peace. And it's up to us who are adherents of our religions to ensure that we lift up those strands of our religious traditions that can and should promote peace, which so often fail to do so, as you've seen firsthand. So I want to thank you once again for this incredible presentation, thought-provoking presentation today. And I want to thank everyone else who has remained with us, the panelists from this morning and some from yesterday as well are here today. We have benefited so greatly from your insights, from your experiences, from your wisdom, and we will take them with us. We will remember the genocides that took place in Rwanda and in Bosnia. We will remember that we should remember, and rather than continue to say never again, to learn from these experiences and to work towards truly bringing about peace that is sustainable and just. So thanks to everyone who stayed with us throughout this conference, which lasted 2 days. The recordings, for those of you who are still here, will be available. They'll be emailed to you sometime next week for both yesterday's sessions and today. So once again, thanks so much to everyone for being with us, and I hope you all stay well.